Derbyshire is known for its old halls, lonely roads, and ancient stone circles, but some of its strangest stories are found in the quiet villages of the Peak District. Among them is a funeral procession said to appear near Ashford in the water, where 12 headless men carry an empty coffin along a narrow lane. The coffin is not believed to belong to any of them. Local tradition claims it is being carried for the person who sees the procession. So who were the 12 pallbearers? And why is there still an empty place waiting among the dead? Doehole Lane passes through the countryside near Ashford, running between fields, hedgerows, and scattered homes. On Christmas Eve in 2015, a driver and passenger were travelling along the lane when a figure appeared in the road ahead of them. It had the shape of a person, covered by a long cloak, with a hood pulled over its head. Both witnesses described the figure as transparent. Yet it appeared clearly enough in the vehicle's headlights for the driver to believe someone had stepped into their path. The figure began crossing the lane directly in front of them. The driver braked hard. For a few seconds, both people inside the vehicle watched the cloaked shape moving towards the opposite side of the road. Its face remained hidden beneath the hood, and it continued across the lane at a steady pace. As it approached the hedgerow, the figure vanished. The driver and passenger were left staring at an empty stretch of road. There was no sign of anyone at the verge or in the field beyond. The cloaked figure had disappeared before reaching the hedge. No name or identity has ever been connected to the apparition. There is no clear explanation for why a hooded figure would appear on Doehole Lane, or why it was seen crossing the road on Christmas Eve. For the two people inside that vehicle, the encounter lasted only a few moments, but it is remembered for a lifetime. Swinger Lane runs through the countryside near Ashford, following a quiet route bordered by fields and hedges. One witness travelling along the lane reported seeing a cyclist ahead of them, moving through the darkness. At first, the figure appeared ordinary enough. A lone rider was travelling along the road, following the same narrow stretch used by local traffic. As the witness drew closer, the cyclist took on a pale, indistinct appearance. The figure then disappeared from view. The encounter did not end when the cyclist vanished. Later, after the witness parked their van along Swinger Lane, heavy banging began against the side of the vehicle. The sound came from outside, close enough to suggest that someone was striking the metal bodywork. The witness remained inside while the blows continued, yet no person could be seen near the van. Swinger Lane has since become associated with both parts of the same account. The cyclist seen travelling along the road, and the unexplained banging heard after the vehicle stopped. The identity of the rider remains unknown. No name or local story has been firmly connected to the figure, leaving only the witness's report of a cyclist who appeared along the lane and the blows that followed after the journey had ended. The roads around Haddon Hall have long been linked with a much older form of haunting. Local tradition speaks of a coach driven through the surrounding countryside by a headless coachman. The carriage is said to be pulled by 6 horses, each one also missing its head. Together they move through the lanes near the estate as a complete procession, the coachman holding the reins while the animals carry the vehicle onward. The apparition gives no clear destination and no reason for its journey. The coach is simply said to appear in the neighbourhood around Haddon Hall, travelling along roads that have been used for centuries. The coachman's identity has never been established. No confirmed name has been attached to him, and the 6 horses remain part of the same local legend. Haddon Hall itself has stood in Derbyshire for hundreds of years, and the countryside around it has changed far less than many places nearby. The old roads, stone walls, and wooded ground provide the setting for a story that has survived through local tradition. Those who spoke of the coach described a full team passing through the area, 6 headless horses, a headless driver, and the carriage following behind them. Then the procession would be gone, leaving the road quiet once more. St. Margarets Chapel stands in Alderworsley, a small village surrounded by the Derbyshire countryside. The building once served the local community as a place of worship, but after it fell out of regular use, the chapel became quiet. Local people later began reporting sounds from inside. On some occasions, singing could be heard coming through the chapel walls. The voices seemed to belong to several people gathered together, carrying the steady rhythm of a hymn or church service. Anyone passing nearby might have expected to find a congregation inside, yet the building was disused at the time. The sound of a bell has also been reported. It was heard ringing from the chapel, as it once would have done when calling worshippers to a service. The reports contain no sighting of a priest, congregation, or anyone entering the building. The chapel itself remained closed and undisturbed while the sounds carried into the surrounding area. There is no known event identifying the voices or connecting them to one particular person from Alderwesley's past. Local tradition has simply preserved the reports of worship continuing inside a chapel that was no longer holding services. For those who heard it, the old building did not seem entirely abandoned. Somewhere beyond its stone walls, voices were still joining together in song, and the chapel bell was still calling out across the village. Alfreton House has been linked with unexplained footsteps for many years. In 2004, the sound was heard moving along one of the building's empty corridors. The footsteps were clear and steady, as though someone were walking across bare wooden floorboards. Each step carried the hard, hollow sound normally associated with an uncovered floor. But the corridor was carpeted. The sound continued along the passage, even though no one could be seen there. Anyone walking across the carpet should have produced a much softer noise, yet the footsteps remained sharp and distinct. The haunting is said to date back to the 1940s, suggesting that the 2004 report was not the first time the sound had been noticed inside the house. There is no known identity attached to the unseen walker. For those who heard it, the sound belonged to the house from another era, one in which someone was still walking the corridor exactly as they had done years before. At Castle Hill in Bakewell, an old boarding house became associated with the name of Jim Marlowe, a butler said to have worked in the building many years ago. According to local tradition, he died in an upstairs room on a Friday night. The story claims he took his own life, although the details surrounding his death have not been firmly established. What followed became part of the house's reputation. Every Friday, footsteps were said to begin near the pantry. They would move through the lower part of the building, then start climbing the staircase towards the room where Jim Marlowe was believed to have died. The route was always the same. The sound began where the butler would once have worked, then continued upwards through the house until it reached the upper floor. Those who heard the footsteps reported no figure accompanying them. Only the sound of someone leaving the pantry and making the familiar journey upstairs. The weekly pattern gave the haunting its name, Friday. Overton Hall in Ashford had already gathered a reputation for being haunted when a pastor and his wife lived there during the 1950s. In 1956, the pastor's wife left the hall, saying that she could no longer remain in the house because of the ghostly activity she had experienced there. Local people believed the haunting was connected to Mrs. Jessup, the third wife of a former owner of the property. Her apparition would appear outside the hall, walking slowly across the grassy forecourt. She was usually seen alone, moving across the open ground before fading from sight. By the time the pastor's wife moved away, the figure had become closely linked with Overton Hall. Those familiar with the story believed Mrs. Jessup had continued the walk she once took during her life, near the hall. St. Anselm's School in Bakewell became linked with an unusual ghost story during the mid-20th century. A social event was being held at the school, and several guests gathered on the garden steps for a group photograph. One of the masters arranged the picture and took the photograph while the group stood together outside. The image appeared ordinary until it was developed. Standing among the guests was a young boy dressed in Victorian clothing. His clothes belonged to an earlier period and immediately set him apart from everyone else in the photograph. When those present were shown the image, none of them could remember seeing the boy on the steps. He had not been noticed while the group assembled, and no one recognized him as a pupil or guest from the event. The boy appeared clearly enough to be part of the gathering, standing close to the people who had knowingly posed for the camera. His identity was never established, and the photograph became part of the ghost stories connected with the school. For everyone who remembered that afternoon, the group on the steps had contained one fewer person than the photograph later revealed. Near Ashford in the Water, Shady Lane in Great Longstone has long been associated with a funeral procession, unlike any ordinary burial. The figures are said to appear as 12 headless men carrying a coffin between them. They move together along the lane in silence, keeping the steady pace of pallbearers following an unseen route. The coffin they carry is empty. Local tradition claims the space inside is reserved for the person who sees the procession. The men continue along Shady Lane near Thornbridge Hall, their bodies visible beneath the weight of the coffin, while their missing heads mark them as something far removed from the living. The origin of the story has never been firmly established. No funeral, family, or single death has been conclusively linked to the 12 figures. Yet the legend has remained part of the area for generations. 12 headless pallbearers moving through the Derbyshire countryside, carrying an empty coffin for the witness who happens to meet them. On a hill just beyond Alderworsley, one witness reported coming across a figure unlike anyone they had seen before. The figure stood around 4 feet tall and wore a green pointed hat. It was close to the ground, tending to the plants growing on the hillside. The witness described the encounter as a sudden meeting rather than a distant glimpse. They had come upon the figure while moving through the area and found it occupied with feeding the vegetation around it. Local folklore has often connected small beings in green clothing with fairies or nature spirits, and the Alderworsley account later became associated with those older traditions. The most unusual part of the sighting was the task the figure seemed to be carrying out. It appeared to be caring for the plants, quietly working among them on the hill. After watching the figure for almost an hour, the encounter ended with the witness leaving behind a small figure in a pointed green hat, still occupied with the vegetation growing around Alderworsley. They have since returned, but never seen the figure again. Around Barlborough, local tradition speaks of a large black dog seen moving through the surrounding countryside. The animal is described as being as tall as a very large collie, with a dark shape that stands out against the lanes and open ground around the village. Unlike many stories of phantom black dogs, this creature is said to belong to the fairies. That connection places it within an older kind of Derbyshire folklore, where supernatural animals were sometimes believed to guard certain places, accompany unseen beings, or appear near land associated with fairy activity. The Black Collie is said to wander alone, appearing briefly before moving out of sight. Its size and dark colouring have made it one of the more unsettling figures connected with Barlborough. It survives instead as part of the local tradition surrounding the area, a great black dog linked with the fairies, roaming the Derbyshire countryside. Arbor Low stands on high ground in the Derbyshire countryside, surrounded by open fields and wide views across the White Peak. The ancient stone circle has been part of the landscape for thousands of years, and local folklore connects the site with a boggart said to haunt the area. The creature is believed to become active after dark. Those who remain near the stones for too long are said to risk disturbing it. Stories of boggarts often describe them as unpredictable beings tied to a particular place. At Arbor Low, the warning has become closely linked with the circle itself and the land surrounding it. Visitors who linger after sunset are said to hear movement around the stones or sense that something is close by, hidden in the darkness beyond the circle. The old belief remains simple. Once night falls at Arbor Low, the stones are no longer considered empty. Near Alport, stands a small group of ancient stones known as the 9 Stones, even though only 4 remain. Local folklore gives them another name, the Grey Ladies. According to one version of the legend, the stones come to life at midnight and begin to dance across the moor. Another tradition places the movement at midday, when the figures are said to leave their positions and gather nearby. A second story connects the stones with the fairies. Hundreds of them are believed to meet around the site, dancing and celebrating among the rocks. The legends have remained attached to the monument for generations, linking the old stones with gatherings that belong more to folklore than history. Whether they are remembered as the Grey Ladies or as a meeting place for fairies, the 9 Stones have never been treated as ordinary rocks. In local tradition, they are waiting for the hour when the dancing begins. Barlborough Hall, now part of Mount St Mary's College, has long been linked with reports of a female apparition. She is said to appear on nights of the full moon, moving through the old building in colours that seem to change from one sighting to the next. Some witnesses have described her as grey, others have seen her in blue or white. Her identity has never been firmly established. But the changing colour of her appearance has become one of the best-known details connected with the hall. Another story is attached to a room in the upper part of the building. Local tradition claims that a priest was murdered there, leaving behind a blood stain that remained for many years. Even after repeated attempts to remove it, the mark was said to return. The stain became part of the same haunted reputation as the woman seen during the full moon. At Barlborough Hall, the stories have endured together, the woman whose colour shifts between grey, blue and white, and the dark stain that refuses to remain gone. Hassop Hall was once known for a large beech tree that stood within its grounds. According to local tradition, the tree could speak. Anyone standing close enough was said to hear a whisper coming from its branches. The voice repeated the name of the person who truly owned the estate. The story became tied to questions of inheritance and rightful possession, as though the tree held knowledge that could not be hidden by legal papers, family claims, or changes of ownership. The beech eventually disappeared from the grounds, but the legend remained. For generations, people remembered Hassop Hall as the place where a tree was believed to reveal the truth, quietly naming the rightful owner to anyone prepared to listen. High on Baslow Edge stands a large gritstone boulder known as the Eagle Stone. It has been part of the Derbyshire landscape for generations, and local tradition gives it a strange power. According to the story, the stone will sometimes turn itself over when it hears a cockerel crow. The belief does not describe a sudden crash or a violent movement. Instead, the rock is said to shift of its own accord, answering the sound carried across the surrounding land. Set against the open ground of Baslow Edge, the stone has long attracted attention because of its size and isolated position. That setting helped preserve the legend, with the old rock becoming more than part of the scenery. The Eagle Stone still remains on the edge today, overlooking the countryside. And with the old story still attached to it, the rock is remembered not only for its size, but for the moment when a cockerel's call is said to make it turn. Derbyshire's ghost stories do not belong to one type of place. Some are attached to old halls and village churches. Others are found on narrow lanes, open moorland, and ancient ground where the landscape has carried the same stories for generations. Perhaps that is why these stories continue. Derbyshire is filled with places that have changed very little over time. The old roads still follow the same routes. The stone circles remain on the hills. The churches, halls and villages still stand where generations before us knew them. Thank you for joining me for yet another Haunted Britain Thursday. Until next time.